A lonely rancher finds a wounded Comanche widow in his stable. His kindness begins in the most unexpected place. The first thing Elias Quinn saw, half buried in the snowdrift beside the old cattle fence, was the red. Not the kind of red that came from clothing or berries or the filtered evening sun. It was blood, dark and fresh, melting the frost where it touched. Then came the hair, thick and black as raven's wings, fanned out like a warning. And finally, the hand, small, unmoving, half-curled against the ice as if in defiance. He didn't run toward her. He didn't shout. Elias was a man who didn't react the way others might. Instead, he stood there for a beat too long, boots rooted to the cold earth, rifle still slung over his shoulder, pulse thundering in his throat. The mountain didn't give up people. It kept them. So whatever this was, it wasn't an accident. It was a message. Or maybe something else entirely. A trigger. A reckoning. He stepped closer. The woman, native, young, torn open along her ribs and soaked through, was still breathing. Barely. He dropped to his knees, hands already moving, checking her pulse, checking her eyes. She flinched as he touched her, eyelids fluttering, lips moving in some language he didn't recognize. It didn't matter. Nothing about her presence made sense. And still, Elias didn't hesitate. He'd been a scout, a survivor, a father, a husband. Now he was none of those things. But this was something he could do, something that still mattered. He scooped her up, staggering only slightly under the dead weight of her body. The fire in his cabin had been out for hours, but when he kicked the door open with his heel, cradling her close, it was like the whole place woke up again. He didn't know her name, or what kind of hell she'd come crawling from, but Elias Quinn had made a choice that couldn't be undone. Whatever storm she brought with her, he was in it now. You're watching Cracks of Light, where forgotten lives meet unexpected redemption. If you're moved by stories of strength in silence and survival in shadows, make sure to subscribe and follow the journey all the way through. Now, let's begin. The door slammed shut behind him, snow curling along the floorboards, melting into the seams of his battered boots. Elias laid the woman down on the only cot he hadn't torched after his family died. He never meant to sleep there again. But tonight wasn't about memory. It was about blood and breath. She was burning up. He didn't need a thermometer to know. He'd felt enough death to recognize what it looked like before it arrived. Fever, shock, and fear. Her skin was fire beneath his hands, her body too light, too fragile, like she'd been running for days. Maybe she had. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. There'd be time for that, if she lived. Instead, he worked, boiling snow water, cleaning the wound, ripping his last clean flannel into strips for bandages. She fought him at first, weak swats that barely registered, but the instinct to survive was still in her, tucked between clenched teeth and half-conscious gasps. He held her down when he had to, talked in low tones when she cried out in a language that twisted his gut. Elias had lost people in every way a man can lose someone. Fire, war, distance. But nothing haunted him more than silence. This silence, the kind that wrapped around her like a noose, was the worst. She hadn't made a sound in hours. Her chest rose, fell, rose again, just enough to make him hope. The next morning, he sat in the corner with his coffee going cold, watching that rhythm, that fragile pulse of life he dragged in from the blizzard. And for the first time in a long while, he wondered what it meant to be needed again. Elias didn't sleep much those first nights. Not deeply. The kind of rest he got was light, broken, always with one ear turned toward the shallow breathing from the cot in the corner. Every cough, every shift beneath the rough blankets pulled his mind away from the edge of dream and slammed it back into the cold now. He kept the fire low but steady, boiled water in small batches, and changed her bandages without expecting thanks. He spoke to her in half sentences. This might sting, or breathe through it, knowing she didn't understand, but maybe recognizing the cadence of calm. When she moaned, he'd answer with quiet, grounding sounds. Not words, just a voice present. It took nearly 3 days before she opened her eyes long enough to see him clearly. When she did, she recoiled. Her body tried to move before it was ready, and the pain hit fast. She cried out, not loud, but sharp, and pushed away the broth he tried to offer. Her gaze darted around the cabin, wild and full of confusion, the fear in it deep and old. Elias backed off. He'd dealt with wounded animals before, men too, feral from loss, from war, from betrayal. He recognized the look in her. Whatever world she'd come from, trust had been beaten out of it. Still, he kept showing up. He didn't press, didn't question. He just returned every hour with something simple: water, a clean cloth, a few slow, deliberate movements to change her dressings. She flinched less each time. She still hadn't spoken a word by the 5th day, but her eyes followed him now. That was something. He tried gestures, slow and clear, pointing to the fire, then to himself, then making a small mock flame with his fingers. A smile tugged at her lips, hesitant but real. He pointed to himself again, tapping his chest. "Elias," he said slowly. She stared. He repeated it, a few more times. Nothing. Then, on the 6th morning, she spoke. One word, barely a whisper. "Anka." He stopped what he was doing, turned fully toward her, and nodded once. "Anka," he repeated. Her name settled between them like fragile glass. He didn't ask where she came from. Not yet. He hadn't earned that. But he started noticing the details. Her clothes, or what was left of them, were handmade, stitched with bone and dyed with patterns unfamiliar to him. Her wrist carried a band of rawhide knotted around a small bone charm. He recognized the craftsmanship. Not Comanche, not Apache either. Something older, more obscure. He didn't touch it, just saw how her fingers curled protectively over it when she slept. That same day, while changing her bandage, he saw the ink. A tattoo, low on her ribs, almost missed it under the bruising. A set of lines, geometric but not random. Purposeful. Elias wasn't fluent in tribal dialects, but he'd seen marks like that before, back when he scouted with the army. Marks of passage, of guardianship, of memory. This girl, this Anka, she wasn't just someone's daughter or sister. She was a keeper of something. She didn't speak more than a few words at a time. Her English, if she had any, was buried under layers of exhaustion and trauma. So they spoke in other ways. He'd show her the pot, raise an eyebrow, and wait. If she nodded, he served. If she looked away, he stepped back. Some nights, he'd leave small things by her cot. A sprig of pine she once held in her fingers for an hour. A stone, smooth and white, that she traced lines across as if reading. And once, a crow feather that made her eyes fill with something close to sadness. Not tears, just wait. She took it without looking at him. The days passed like that, wordless but far from silent. He could feel her strength returning in tiny increments. She moved more, ate more, kept her eyes on the windows like she was waiting for someone. Or something. Elias began locking the doors again, something he hadn't bothered with in years. Not out of fear of her, but of whatever had driven her here. One night, while checking the traps near the treeline, he found the signs. Old prints. Hoofed. More than one rider. They hadn't come close. Just circled wide. Watching. That night, he loaded his rifle and slept with it within reach. He didn't tell Anka, but he noticed the way she held her charm tighter when the wind howled, as if she knew. Whatever storm had brought her to his doorstep wasn't done. And neither was he. It started with the tracks. Elias found them just past the northern ridge, where the frost held longer and the pine needles stayed dry underfoot. For maybe 5 horses. Heavy set. Men who knew how to ride quiet and tight. The snow had drifted in since, but not enough to hide the pattern. They'd circled once wide, staying just out of sight of the cabin line. Watching. Testing. That same afternoon, a thin column of smoke snaked up from the east, unnatural and bitter, the kind that came from scorched brush, not accident, but intent. Elias stood on the edge of the treeline, rifle slung loose over his shoulder, jaw tight. This wasn't a traveler's fire. This was a signal, a warning, or bait. He didn't take it. He just went home, silent as the dusk, and began to prepare. The doors were locked, the rifle cleaned. He sharpened the knife he hadn't touched in months. Then he waited. They came 2 mornings later. No subtlety this time. 5 riders cresting the hill like they owned it. At their center rode Victor Graun. Elias didn't have to ask his name. You could feel the shape of a man like that before you knew the words to define him. Tall, pale-eyed, movements too calm. The kind of calm built on the confidence of always getting what you wanted. He wore a long, dark coat lined with cavalry buttons, but there was nothing military in his presence, just calculation. Beside him rode a man twice the size, red beard like rust down his chest, scarred down his mouth. The others flanked behind, dust rising off their coats, rifles across their backs. Elias stepped out onto the porch slow, hands visible. He didn't invite them in, didn't speak first, just let the silence draw out long enough to demand respect or danger. Gron smiled, tight and cold. "Mr. Quinn," he said, voice smooth like water over shale. "You seen anyone pass through here recently?" Elias didn't flinch. "Snow's been heavy. Not much passes through anything." Gron nodded, as if agreeing with a truth he didn't care about. "We're looking for a woman. Native. Wounded. Dangerous. Stole something that don't belong to her." His eyes drifted past Elias, toward the shuttered windows behind. "You'd remember if you saw her." Elias met his gaze. "I've been alone out here a long time. Closest thing to company I gets the wind." A pause, long enough to invite a challenge. "Nothing out here worth stealing." The man with the scar let out a low chuckle, but it wasn't amusement. Gron dismounted, slow and easy. "Mind if we look around?" Elias didn't move. "You can look out here. My cabin's private." "Private?" Gron raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. "You hiding a wife in there?" Elias's jaw ticked once. "No one hides out here. They survive." The men behind Gron shifted, hands twitching near their belts. Tension crackled. Elias didn't back down. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "If you're hunting trouble, you're late. Winter got here first." Gron's smile dropped for half a second, just enough to let the wolf show underneath. "You're ex-army, aren't you, Quinn? Used to tracking, shooting, killing. That right?" Elias didn't answer, didn't blink. The truth hung in the air anyway. "I'd hate for old habits to resurface," Gron said, stepping back toward his horse. "But sometimes old instincts get men killed." Elias's voice was low. "Only if they're pointed in the wrong direction." They left after that. No shots, no blows, just a lingering stink of arrogance and something more dangerous, certainty. As they rode off, Elias stayed on the porch, watching the dust settle. His knuckles were white on the rifle stock. Inside, behind the curtain, Anka hadn't made a sound. She didn't need to. He knew she'd heard every word. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did she. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence full of decisions not yet spoken. But the line had been drawn, and he'd already chosen his side. It was late, maybe past midnight, when Anka finally spoke. Not in broken words or cautious glances, but in full sentences. Her voice was quiet, dry from disuse, but steady. Elias had been sharpening a blade by the fire, half-focused, until her words cut through the silence with more weight than steel. "You should have let me die," she said. He didn't look up. He let her keep going. "If they find me again, they'll kill you too." Elias set the blade down slow. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't regret it." Anka watched the fire like she was reading something inside it. "They came for us 2 winters ago. Men like the one who stood on your porch. Victor Gron. They wore uniforms, but they weren't soldiers. They brought fire, not law." Her hands tightened in her lap, nails digging into her skin. "My people, we didn't fight. Not at first. We thought if we gave them nothing, they'd leave." She looked at Elias, her eyes hard now. They didn't want trade. They wanted a place that shouldn't be theirs. A place they couldn't understand. She reached beneath her shirt and pulled out the bundle she always wore around her neck. Carefully, she untied it. Inside was a piece of white stone, almost glowing under the firelight, and a twisted braid of dried herbs bound in red thread. "My grandfather was the keeper," she said, "of the valley. We call it Yelonaka. You'd say White Gold Valley." Elias had heard stories like this before, but not like this. Not from someone with hands still healing from the cost. "The land there," she continued, "it heals. Not just wounds, not just sickness. It clears what poisons the spirit. 4 generations we protected it. Hid it from outsiders. Not out of greed, out of mercy. Not everyone should be healed. Not every illness is meant to go away. Her voice shook once, but didn't break. Victor heard about it from a trader, an exile, someone we trusted once. When he came to our camp, he smiled, asked for peace, asked for water. He brought food for the children. My grandfather let him in. She closed her eyes. That night, they tied him to the sacred tree and bled him for answers. He told them nothing. They burned his body and left it for us to find. I was supposed to carry the map, but there is no map. He made sure of that. The path to the valley is learned through fire and memory, passed through bloodlines, not paper. I carry it here. She tapped her temple once, then her heart, and now they chase what they cannot read, what they can only destroy. Elias sat still, staring at the bundle in her hand. That's why they want you, he said. She nodded once. Victor thinks if he breaks me, he finds a valley. He doesn't care what it does, only what he can sell. Her voice went flat. He thinks it's gold. He doesn't know it's older than his name. There was a long silence between them. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. What happens if he does find it? She looked him straight in the eye. He turns healing into power, and power into ash. She closed the bundle and pressed it to her chest. That land isn't his. It doesn't belong to men like him. It chooses. It remembers. Elias didn't say much after that, but he didn't have to. The look in his eyes had changed. The way he watched the door. The way he listened to the wind. She'd told him the truth, and now it belonged to him too. Whatever came next, he wasn't just protecting a woman anymore. He was standing between greed and something sacred, and that meant there was no going back. Elias woke before dawn, same as always, but the rhythm was different now. He didn't make coffee, didn't sit by the window with a rifle across his knees. Instead, he stepped outside into the hard cold and began to walk the line. It was muscle memory at first, his boots finding the same old tracks, his eyes reading the land like an old language. But the purpose had changed. He wasn't guarding solitude anymore. He was building a perimeter. Every weak patch of fence became a warning line. Every narrow trail between trees became a choke point. He started dragging branches to obscure angles, digging shallow pits, laying tripwires from fishing line and bells. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It just had to slow them, confuse them, give him a moment longer to kill if he had to. Anka watched him without speaking. She didn't question, just followed. When he handed her a knife and pointed to a low snare line he'd strung across the side path, she nodded once and got to work. She moved with care, not fear. She had done this before. Not like him, tactical, trained, but her own way. Silent, swift, intuitive. When he showed her how to reload the Winchester, she picked it up quick. When he drew a map of the area in dirt with his finger, she memorized it with a glance. It didn't need many words. The work spoke loud enough. Days turned into a pattern. Set the traps. Check the brush. Sharpen blades. Watch the horizon. Elias taught her how to hold a rifle. Not like a soldier, but like someone who wanted to survive. She showed him how to move through shadow without leaving a trace. He watched her pull her hair back tight, the focus in her eyes. She watched him clean the barrel of the old pistol with hands steady as stone. At night, they sat on opposite sides of the fire. Closer now. No longer just out of necessity. Sometimes their fingers brushed when they passed supplies or leaned close to study a hand-drawn diagram. Neither pulled away. One evening, Elias found her by the barn, practicing with the bow she'd pieced together from the scraps he let her take. Her aim was solid. Her eyes didn't flinch. He stood behind her, corrected her stance without touching her, just guiding with his voice. Breathe before the pull, not during. She adjusted, released, hit clean. She looked back at him. He didn't smile. Didn't need to. She saw it anyway. The tension that had once been survival was shifting. It became something else. Something that rose in the quiet moments. When she rested her head back against the wall, eyes closed, trusting he'd keep watch. When he caught himself looking too long at the curve of her jaw, the edge of her mouth when she concentrated. They didn't speak of it. It wasn't time, but it was there, growing. He gave her the cot now, took the floor. When she protested, he told her the truth. I sleep better on hard ground. She knew it was only partly true, The next morning, he found her outside, adding stone to the blind near the creek. She'd done it in silence, but with precision. When he raised an eyebrow, she simply said, "More cover. For when we shoot." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't tender. But it was real. Between them was a trust forged not in conversation, but in action. A kind of bond neither of them had chosen, but both had accepted. The kind built when two people have seen the worst of the world and still choose to stand back to back. By the end of the week, the ranch was no longer a refuge. It was a trap, a waiting place, and they were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a team. One plan, one fight, one promise hanging in the air, unspoken. If they came again, they would not find prey. They would find something that didn't run, didn't break, something ready. The first shot came just after dawn. Not from the ridge, not from the tree line, from the creek bed. Elias had placed a decoy rifle there, lashed to a stump and covered in an old blanket to look like a crouching figure. It worked. The crack of the rifle echoed through the valley, sharp and arrogant, the mark of men who thought they had the upper hand. Elias didn't move. He was already in position on the far bluff, tucked behind stone and brush, rifle steady across a slab of cold granite. Beside him, Anka crouched low, bout in hand, breath controlled, eyes locked on the lower field. The riders came slow, deliberate. 12 this time. Victor at the front. He wasn't wearing the coat anymore. No pretense. Just leather and a gun belt that told the truth. They moved in a wide formation, scanning for traps. They were smart. Not smart enough. The first man who stepped into the clearing took a hidden wire across the knee, pitched forward hard, and the second bullet Elias fired snapped his shoulder back before he could scream. Chaos bloomed in an instant. Shouts, dust, hooves kicking up panic. They scrambled for cover, but the open ground gave them nothing. Elias shifted, reloaded, fired again. He didn't waste time aiming to wound. Victor didn't flinch. He barked orders, rallied his men toward the barn, flanked hard right. That's when Anka moved. Silent as breath, she slipped down the slope, disappearing into the cover she knew better than they ever could. Elias covered her without thinking, dropping another rider who tried to follow. The scream that followed wasn't from the gunshot. It was from the arrow Anka buried deep into the thigh of a man near the north fence. She was already gone before he hit the ground. They pressed in fast, closing the circle. Elias shifted to the second position, just like they'd planned, falling back toward the main porch but keeping the line clear. He could hear them now. Boots on wood, curses shouted in 3 different accents, metal clashing against the cabin door. Someone kicked it open, found it empty. That was fine. Elias wasn't in the cabin. He was behind it. When Cutter came into view, red beard, wide chest, blood on his knuckles, Elias fired point blank. The round took him low, just above the belt. He fell hard and didn't get up. That was the last of the ones Elias recognized. The rest were just shadows with rifles and no names. They scattered like smoke when he moved to the east post, drawing fire, baiting them into the kill zone. Then he saw her, Anka, halfway up the barn roof, bow drawn, body stretched like something primal. She loosed another arrow, dead center into the chest of a man who had Elias in his sights. No hesitation, no doubt. He met her eyes across the space between gunfire, and nodded once. Victor broke cover near the fire pit, pistol raised, moving fast. Elias turned, shouldered his rifle, squeezed the trigger, and nothing. Jammed. He ducked instinctively as the first bullet clipped the stone behind him. Rolled, drew the sidearm. Too far. Victor charged. And then Anka's voice rang out. Elias. Her cry wasn't fear. It was warning. He turned, saw her silhouette behind Victor, arrow already mid-flight. It struck Victor's arm just as he fired. The shot went wide. Elias didn't hesitate. He took aim and pulled the trigger. One shot. Clean. Direct. The echo was the only sound left. Victor staggered, mouth open in shock, eyes locked on Elias like he couldn't understand how it had ended this way. He fell to his knees, then forward into the dirt. Done. The rest ran, dispersed into trees like cowards. There was no order left, no one to follow, Just the smell of smoke and blood and the heavy silence that always came after the storm. Elias lowered the rifle. His hand was shaking now, not from fear, from release. He turned toward the barn. Anka was already moving toward him, slow, steady, bow still in hand. Her eyes locked with his again, but this time they held something new, something final. Not relief, not victory, recognition. They had survived, not just the battle, but the choice to fight together, to trust, to bleed, to stand their ground. Elias reached for her hand. This time she took it and didn't let go. They buried the bodies far from the cabin, near the creek bend where the wind carried the scent away. Elias didn't say much during it. Neither did Anka. Words didn't belong there. The men who came had names once, maybe families, but they died chasing something they didn't understand. Victor was last. No marker, no prayers, just dirt and silence. When it was done, Elias washed the blood from his hands and came back to find Anka standing alone beside the old cedar post where his wife once tied drying herbs. In her hands was the medicine bundle, her grandfather's, passed down to protect, not to destroy. She tied it high above the doorframe, a quiet act of defiance and remembrance. Then she sang, a single, steady melody in a language Elias didn't know, but he didn't need to. It was a song for those who came before, for the land that endured, for the healing that still waited in the hidden places. Her voice rose with the smoke from the hearth, and he stood beside her, not as a guard, not as a savior, just as someone who stayed, as someone who chose to. The days after were slow but full. They patched the roof, replaced the broken windows. Anka stitched new linens from salvaged cloth. Elias fixed the fence line. But there was no rush now, no looming shadow. For the first time in years, everything didn't feel temporary. At night, they sat by the fire, closer now, their hands brushing without hesitation. Sometimes she'd hum that same song in pieces. Sometimes he'd tell her a memory, short, dry, never embellished. And she'd listen like it mattered, because now it did. Spring came sooner than expected. The frost pulled back, the trees shifted. The land didn't forget what happened, but it allowed something new to grow. One morning, Anka reached for his hand as they stepped outside, her fingers warm and certain in his. He didn't ask where she'd go next. He didn't have to. She wasn't running anymore, and neither was he. This place, scarred and sacred, had become theirs, not through ownership, through choice, through survival, through the quiet, powerful promise that sometimes, after enough pain, comes peace. And maybe that's what this story is really about. Not revenge, not escape, but two people who had every reason to give up, choosing not to, choosing to stand, to believe in something again, even if that something is just one more day, together. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength that lives in silence and the beauty found in rebuilding, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Cracks of Light. More stories like this are waiting, and sometimes all it takes to find the light is a crack.